Hello, this is the DPS Group, and we will be presenting a formal proposal as to how we believe that we can improve the socioeconomic disparities between inner city and suburban schools.
Hello, my name is Jenna Bazan, and I am currently a public health major at Wayne State University.
Hi, my name is Yashad Singh. I'm an electrical engineering major here at Wayne State, and I research the impact of COVID-19 on inner city schools.
Hello, my name is Emil Milkic, and I am studying computer science at Wayne State University, and I plan on getting my master's here as well. My subject of research for this project was funding and technology.
I'm Mira Zanik, and I'm a biochem and math major, and I research racial inequalities between suburban and inner city schools.
Hello, my name is Deja Gaines, and I am a civil and environmental engineering major at Wayne State University.
Hi everyone, my name is Alana Baldwin. I'm a senior at Wayne State University, and I'm currently studying electrical and computer engineering.
In this presentation, we will discuss the differences between inner city and suburban schools in terms of test scores, teachers, the impact of COVID-19, and funding and technology. Our recommendations are to create petitions and invoke different taxes.
So overall, inner city schools rank much lower and also have much lower test scores than that of suburban schools. So to further my research, I wanted to look into some factors as to why that could be the case. There are two causes to lower test scores, and they are school-related and teacher-related. School-related problems can be low funding, which means access to fewer teachers, and building expansions, which means less classrooms, and also lowered expectations. And by lowered expectations, an example of this could be in Florida, in response to low test scores on the FCAT exam, which is the state standardized test. They lowered the passing score, which basically just allowed more students to pass. But doing so, that means that students have to put in less effort in the future. Other problems, the second problem, which is teacher-related problems, are lack of teaching experience, which can really just be improved over time, lack of dispassion or just dispassion for teaching, which can affect the mood that students have in the classroom or just overall their environment, that learning environment, and how they view the subject, and also poor classroom management, which kind of plays into the teacher to student ratio. If there's too many students within the classroom, it makes it hard for teachers to manage all of those students at one time. So the teachers end up focusing more on management rather than actually the subject that needs to be taught. My solutions to all of these problems is really just to raise funding, because in raising their funding, these schools will have access to hire more teachers. They will also have access to expand their buildings or afford more classrooms. And in affording more classrooms, that's less students per classroom, so lower student to teacher ratio, allowing teachers to not spend as much time on classroom management.
In order to remove the socioeconomic disparities inner city schools face compared to suburban schools, we have to begin by improving the quality of teachers hired and hiring more teachers. Teachers impact the quality of education students receive greatly. Hiring more qualified teachers acts as a snowball effect. With more qualified teachers, testing scores will increase. Once testing scores increase, schools will be able to receive more funding from a state and federal level. Increasing funding will allow for these school districts to fix many of the other issues they face, such as the physical conditions of these schools. Teachers provide students with the necessary resources to be successful in life. They provide them with the foundation needed to go on to a higher education, giving these students a better chance at a successful life. Empty teaching positions are often filled with long-term substitutes, and substitute teachers do not have the credentials or the past experience to teach students long-term. Hiring more teachers and removing these permanent substitute teachers will increase the quality of the education these students receive.
So next I will talk about the impact of COVID-19 and the 4 reasons we found that inner city schools are impacted more. First reason is many students in inner city school districts depend on their schools for school provided meals, which they will no longer have access to. Next, families from inner city school districts relied on their schools for childcare while they worked, which they no longer can do. Another reason is that inner city school students may lack the technology needed to facilitate online learning. And lastly, we found that inner city students may have been more mentally affected by the pandemic and online learning. We researched this in 3 ways. One was our own survey that we conducted amongst Wayne State students about online learning in the pandemic and how it affected their education now, and how it may have affected their education in the past. Another survey that we did or used was one conducted by the California Department of Education, which is on similar topics, but it's conducted among several school districts across California, ranging from high income to low income. And lastly, we used interviews from an article by the LA Times, where they interviewed families from low income and high income school districts across California. One of the key points from our research that really stood out to us were the stats from both surveys that showed just how many families relied on school provided meals. So from the California Department of Education survey, it ranged that from their districts, they found that anywhere from 58 to 80% of the students they surveyed are eligible for free or reduced lunch. From our own survey, we found that 42% of our respondents are eligible for free or reduced lunch. So that shows just how many students this issue impacts. Another key point that our research pointed out was just how many students lack the technology needed for online learning. In the California Department of Education survey, they found that in low income families, only 51% of the people have computers at home, and only 65% of the people have internet at home. And when comparing that to the high income school districts, 87% of those families have a computer, and 97% of those families have internet. So that shows the big disparity there is. In addition, in our own survey, we found that 53% of the respondents of families relied on the schools for their childcare while their families work, which, as I said earlier, will no longer be possible if people have to learn from home. And this is likely to be similar across the country. Lastly, for the interviews from the LA Times, we could see the impact to families interviewed by the LA Times from rich districts say they feel fully confident in the education that they'll receive, whereas families that were interviewed from lower income school districts say they feel frustrated and think that their students are going to fall behind. So the two solutions we came up with for these issues are increasing funding and raising awareness. Increasing funding can help school districts or the students themselves afford the technology needed for online learning. Increasing funding can also help the families afford childcare if they need it so they can continue to work while their student is educating themselves at home. The second solution is raising awareness. Raising awareness can help bring attention to the fact that these students, especially in inner city schools, are going to be mentally impacted by the pandemic and online learning. It can also bring more attention to the fact that many students depended on the school provided meals, and perhaps we can bring up a program such as community provided meals for them now that they're not going to be at school.
Hello, my name is Emil Milkic, and my main role for this subject was the funding section. And essentially what our research has discovered and what we have written about and put our research together for was the funding of the inner city and the suburban schools and how they compared and where they lacked. So we discovered that there's 3 main areas dedicated to funding. There's local funding, state funding, and then federal funding. Local funding is essentially based off of the family income of the surrounding area. So, for example, suburban areas would be taxed more for property, so therefore their local funding would be more for the school. And then there's state funding. State funding is essentially what local funding cannot give. So, for example, if an inner city school does not have enough local funding for the area, state funding would be able to cover that. And then there's the federal funding, which is given mainly to lower income schools, since the the suburban schools already have that local funding on their back. This is where it's kind of skewed because the state funding cannot essentially cover all the lower poverty schools because there's so many inner city schools that are lacking. So therefore, the state funding cannot be able to support all of that. So same goes for federal funding. There's not enough to go around. This is directly tied to their tech and their technology. So due to this being an issue, technology is lacking. They lack their computers, the network. They lack what they need to have proper test scores, and that's what's reflected to it. So we've conducted many surveys asking people if they went to an inner city school or suburban school, and then we compared that, and then we found that the research that we found online was comparable to our surveys. So essentially, there is a gap of funding between the inner city schools and the suburban schools, and this is where our petition section will come into play on how we can stop that. Thank you.
So, as a part of our proposal, one of the things we want to try to implement is a petition, because petitions are a great way for citizens to have a voice in politics and make sure their voice is heard. But it's also an excellent way to make sure that something that you're very passionate about is accessed or heard across a large audience of people. And the language of this petition is equal allocations of state funds on a per pupil basis, because as of right now, state funds are allocated in a way that is based off of test scores. And with inner city schools, test scores ranking lower, they don't have access to as many state funds as those of suburban schools.
Hi everyone. So in addition to petitions, we also recommend tax distribution, and I'll explain what we mean by this. So local funding and state funding will always be the primary sources of funding for public schools. However, suburban schools, they do receive more local funding because the families and the business owners, they pay higher in property taxes, and the local funding is lower in the inner cities for the inner city schools because families, they pay lower in property taxes, and so does the business owners. So we recommend that a portion of the property taxes that suburban families and business owners pay be distributed to local funding for inner city schools. That way, funding will be equal. Equal funding means equal opportunities for both inner city students and the suburban students as well, which is fair.
In conclusion, we would like to increase funding, and doing this will allow for more technology and supplies, create building expansions, increase the number of teachers, and improve the class sizes by including more classrooms so that the teachers can focus on a lesser amount of students at a time.